All right, so welcome to this workshop on summary and paraphrase and on how to avoid plagiarism. Our workshop itinerary, we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between reading and writing and what it is that you do and how it is that you become an expert. That will be kind of filtered throughout our presentation today. We're going to talk about some useful terms and techniques that correspond with those. Talk about some strategies for avoiding plagiarism. And then something for the 6D and 1C. This is the key strategies or techniques for you to take away. But again, note that you can see in the chat all the range of different departments and where people are coming from: education, public policy, systems engineering, excellent, psychology, toxicology, music therapy, anthropology, biomedical engineering. So wonderful to have all of you here. I, for whatever reason, just realized that I skipped our slide and for our writing community guide. And it's just a reminder that when we come together, it's best if we're present, honest, and authentic with one another, and that we listen actively and with respect, that we consider multiple perspectives, that we avoid dominating, that we, if we're challenged, we take a moment and breath and respond with grace. If we're uncertain or confused, we ask a clarifying question, and that after the session that we share only what is ours to share. And by the way, any Q&A, any questions that will not be recorded, or if I accidentally get a couple questions in there, I always take them out before posting online. So just be assured. I did send out a handout, the summary and paraphrase, avoid plagiarism. It gives you just kind of a quick little itinerary to follow, but also those strategies and takeaways, those 6Ds and 1C that we'll talk about today. We'll move through information pretty quickly so that it's kind of compact session. And then, as I mentioned, we'll try to reserve some time at the end for some questions. Here we go. This is the slide I was looking for. So just as a reminder, this is our writing community guide. Research writing. All right. So when we talk about it, we talk about it in CSU Writes in kind of 5 key ways. The top 4 that we tend to think about, though, are product, our genre, and our field specific. The thing that we're putting together is our writing. We talk about it as process, the structure of our documents. If you attended the reverse outlining workshop last week, right? That's part of the process of putting things together. The practice of how it is that you do it, how you sit down and work with it regularly. That's your customary way of doing things. Your project, it could be anything that's moving your project forward. We often try to separate out sometimes research, reading, for example, or bench science or techniques or methods, and then our writing, but they really are kind of best if they're working together. And of course, the last one is who we are as we come to the writing project and who we are in the process. You are always in the process of becoming an expert, even when you can wield the term expert and use that as a moniker for yourself and say, yes, I have become an expert. I'm recognized as an expert in my field on this particular topic. But there's always, as we know, more to learn and ways to grow. And so writing is one of the key ways that we continue to grow and build our expertise through time. It requires deliberate practice, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And that's a particular kind of practice that is not always easy. For those of you who attended the feedback workshop yesterday, we talked about the kind of the difficulties or the challenges of receiving feedback, but how important that is. And that's because it helps us with our systematic way of building and crafting and learning through writing. And it's not always easy, right? It's deliberate. And so I love Anders Ericsson's Peak Performance Focused Secrets of the New Science of Expertise. And he talks in there about how you can build a certain level of expertise or knowledge or skill pretty quickly if you practice enough. But it's only through deliberate practice that you continue to hone your skills and develop. And that means being able to pull things apart and look and see and understand how it is that you're performing in a particular moment. And so I'm going to pull on one of his examples where he worked with violinists in Berlin, and for the music therapist in here, that he looked at how it is that they performed and practiced, and the intensity with which they paid attention to their errors or where they were off, and then how they would go back and strategically work to fix those places. He said the other so there were some violinists who were less interested in that kind of detailed attention to their craft, and they would be good, but they had a certain level that and place where they kind of tapped out. But those who continued to kind of work their craft continued to improve. And I think when we're working with other people's texts and words, and with our own crafting of our ideas on the page, that's a place where we have an opportunity always for deliberate practice. Summary and paraphrase force us to consider how is it that we're reframing and writing what others have written before. And so it's one of those places where I think that it's a place of deep practice. James Clear, he just reminds us that it's not mindless repetition. Deliberate practice requires focused attention and is conducted with a specific goal of improving performance. And again, the reason why we're talking about this in a summary and paraphrase workshop is because oftentimes when we get to the place where we've read X amount of articles for our literature review by X number of experts in the field who may outrank us, right? May have outpublished us, and we're then charged with the task of how do we then distill and work with something that they've already written, which could seem to be so precise and perfect as it is. Well, there are some strategies that we can do to do that. And it's just really helpful for us to keep in mind that we need some time to be able to do that we have to prioritize our reading and writing time. I would say no more than 2 or 3 hours at a time if you can. I know that there are times where we spend days kind of locked into a chair. Finally, we've gotten there, but it's really good if you can break apart your reading and writing sessions, maybe not just from one another, but also then so that you're having time to digest and work through, and then come back the next day or come back the day after and work through that material again. That way your note-taking and your writing practice becomes just what you do every day. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later on. And here's just a reminder from the Write at Speed workshop, where it's really helpful if you draft quickly, dump what it is that you know, and then leave it, and then come back and edit it and clean it up so that you can edit slowly. In editing slowly, that's where you're able to clarify that you're using sources correctly or accurately, that you have clear citations, right, that are accurate representations of what someone else said, and giving credit where credit is due. All right, so some useful terms for us to talk about today: summary, paraphrase, quotation. So we use these all the time. We often use them, particularly summary and paraphrase. We kind of use those terms interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same. So a summary is a short overview of main points of a larger work. So a synonym might be synopsis, brief, finding, a report, an abstract, right? So that you're taking something that is much larger and you're distilling it down into its kind of key main points and elements. Thinking about an abstract, that can be a form of a summary as well. To paraphrase, that's slightly different. That's where you're taking someone's statement and you're rewording it and you're working it into your own thought or expression. And it's their idea comes through, but the expression of it is your own. So it could be rephrase or restate or repeat. I think this is one of the places where we have the greatest challenge and run the greatest risk sometimes of plagiarism. If you're ever in doubt, by the way, quote, and a quotation is a repetition of words and phrases directly from another signaled by quotation marks. The synonym would be an excerpt or a select or a reference. And so those you place in quotation marks. If you're using the general rule that I've heard repeatedly through my career is around 3 words per sentence. If you have 3 keywords from someone else in a sentence, that it's chances are you're running the risk of plagiarizing. So at that point in time, you might just want to quote. You might just want to put whatever they said in quotation marks. And all of the above, those all require citations if you're pulling from someone else's work in your field. Patch writing, quote sandwich, and attribution. So let's talk about these. Patch writing is where you quilt together sources or quotations in a way that overshadows your own research, your own thesis, your own writing. It's really easy for us to do if we're uncertain or new to a topic. And we've got, particularly in literature review, so many other writers who have said great things about our topic and have established the field or set the field. And so it's easy for us to kind of patch together what it is that they've all said. But remember to use sources that support your own work and your own expression of how your work fits within the field, not instead of your work, right? So there's a difference between laying out what others have done so that you can take part in that conversation and demonstrate how it is that your work contributes versus just laying out a topic based on other people's writing about that topic. A quote sandwich. This is highly recommended. Some of you may have already been using this from early on, and that's where the sandwich icon comes on your itinerary. And it's just a reminder that a quotation goes between your introduction to that material, that quotation, and then your explanation of it. So it's always good for you to control how it is that you're using other people's work and writing by introducing it, why it's important or significant, or how it relates to the topic at hand, what it is that they've said, and then how it is that you find it relevant or it connects or you can build off of it. So there's, if you do interpretations or explanations of significance, you really want to be explaining why it is that you're using that quotation or what from their work that you're quoting is why it's important. And attribution, it's just another way of saying giving credit where credit is due. It's the action of ascribing work or a remark to a particular author or artist or person. You can do the ICE method as well, like a quotation sandwich, which is introduce the quotation, cite the quotation, and then explain the quotation. It's another way of talking about the quote sandwich. All right, some useful techniques. Let's talk about that. I've already talked about the quote sandwich, the introduction, the quotation, and the explanation. Another way to think about that, though, is the I say, they say, I say. So what is it that you say about the topic? What is it that they say about the topic? And then what is it that you say again? And always you want to be guiding your reader through the material. Why is it that you're bringing in someone else's voice to talk about this subject matter? Because as soon as you do, and we are all skilled in reading through the documents in our fields where we hit the citations, and sometimes those are put in footnotes, sometimes endnotes, sometimes in parentheses, whatever the citation and style formatting of your field or of that document is. We're pretty skilled at being able to read through and see what it is that you as the author are saying, and then what it is that someone else has said, and then what it is that you're saying about that. The index of templates. This is what I was hoping to drop into the chat, and I will just send out in an email. But this comes from an undergraduate textbook that works with template models for academic writing. It's really, really helpful to have some starter templates on how it is that you introduce someone else's writing, how you might explain that you're summarizing a larger text, right? In a paragraph, you're summarizing an entire monograph, for example, on the topic, versus you're introducing what they said. You're paraphrasing what they've said very quickly about a particular nuanced idea that you're writing about. So it's lovely to have some templates to work from. And so I'll send those out since I couldn't get those into the chat. And if you're watching the recording, by the way, feel free just to email me and I'm happy to send those out. All right, so let's talk about common knowledge. That's one of those things that shifts a lot, because common is, well, actually not all that common. It's common for particular groups and selections of people, but not everybody knows all of the same facts or information. So broadly speaking, though, common knowledge is the information that kind of your average, everyday, educated person would accept as reliable without having to go and look it up or find additional information. So that includes things like information that most people know, such that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, or that Barack Obama was the first American of mixed race to be elected president, right? So there are certain things that we know that are just, we take these for as common knowledge, and we don't have to go back to a source and identify who's the first person who wrote that or said that for us to be able to prove that it's accurate. It could be information that's shared by a cultural or national group. Could be such as the names of heroes, right, that are events in the nation's history that are remembered and celebrated. So what it is that we know as our kind of common knowledge of American history is different than Canadian history, or the history of Mexico. So if we're thinking about culturally how it is that we understand knowledge and accept things as being known and not needing to be cited, 1776 for the Declaration of Independence, for example, those are things that are also culturally situated, but we take for granted. And then we can also think about it, and this is what's particular to you in your fields of knowledge, is a subset of academics will be specialized in your area, and that's knowledge shared by the members of your field. So the fact that it's a necessary condition of diffraction of radiation of wavelength from a crystalline solid is given by Bragg's law. You are, if that is your field, then you don't have to be giving a citation about Bragg's law. You just have to reference Bragg's law. You don't have to cite it. So how do you determine if the information that you're using is common knowledge or not? And you can ask yourself, who's your audience? So who's that group of people that I'm in conversation with? Is it that kind of general or broad? Is it much more narrow and specific to your field? What can I assume that they already know? And will I be asked where I obtain my information? And so some of those things that you might identify as facts, but maybe contentious, it would be good to have some citations, some other scholars who have worked with this material cited within your work, so that you can show where it is that you've obtained your information and how it is that you're approaching that contentious topic, for example. Some examples may be a description of the symptom of Asperger's syndrome would need to be cited for composition in a general writing class, but probably not need citation for an audience of graduate students in psychology, because those audiences are slightly different. Or a reference to the practice of fair value accounting would be understood by a group of economists, but would need a citation for an audience of non-experts. Or a statement, and sorry about the train, folks. It might get louder. Brace yourself. A statement reporting that 24% of the children under the age of 18 live in households headed by single mothers would need to be cited. This is information that would not be known to the average reader who would want to know where that figure was obtained. You think about even journalists, they often give that kind of, according to the, Pew, whatever foundation, according to whomever, right? So they give some context for where it is that they're getting their information, so that we can know that it's a credible source. The best advice, however, is to always cite if you're in doubt. If you're not sure if you need to be citing where it is that you got something, then cite it. And editors will tell you, take that out, or you don't need to be citing that. Generally, you don't need to be citing at this level introductory texts, encyclopedias. So any of those kinds of reference guides, unless they're specialized in your field and they're helping you take a stand on a contentious issue, generally those kinds of reference or introductory textbooks you don't cite. So writing ethically. A general principle underlying ethical writing is the notion that a written work of an author, be it a manuscript or a magazine, scientific journal, a research paper submitted for a course, or a grant proposal submitted to a funding agency, represents an implicit contract between the author of that work and its readers, meaning that we take the fact that it's been submitted by a credible author, right? That itself suggests to us that the writing itself will also be credible. And so we rely on that citation structure to be able to backtrack through and see lineages and connections and other relationships, and how it is that the literature review has been structured, for example, so that we can understand the research that's been done and the connections that are being made as being genuine into the field and connected. And it winds up being that we often just pick up something that's been published and we start reading through it, and we often don't question whether it's going to be credible or not, because we have peer review processes oftentimes for anything, right, that's published. And so we tend to rely on those as being safeguards for checking, fact checking, for identifying if there's something that's miscited or that has been forgotten to be cited, that those mechanisms will have caught those, and we can trust that those are genuine. And just a reminder that it implies a contract between us. And this comes from Roig's Avoiding Plagiarism. You can look it up. He's done a few updates to it. I think 2015 is the most recent one, but if you just type in Avoiding Plagiarism, Self-Plagiarism, and Other Questionable Writing Practices, a guide to ethical writing, you'll find it online. I love that it's available. It's worthwhile to just have on hand. And he's takes you through, I think, 28 different instances of where it is that you can identify the need for ethical writing. When you're reading journals, again, we kind of take for granted that the mechanisms themselves of having an article published have given us a document that has been checked, and that we also believe that our authors then have done their due diligence in being able to connect what it is that they say to what it is that others have said. You can also very easily download citations, right? For those of you who have been attending the source management software systems talks, you know that you can use EndNote or Mendeley or Zotero, any number of other options or ways for being able to track your citations. And so it doesn't have to be onerous, right, or too difficult, but making sure that your readers know where it is that you're getting your information is super important, and we know that. It also goes for figures, though, and this is something that we often forget, that if you are copying another author's figures, that also is a form of plagiarism. And so taking care, we spend most of our time here talking about summary and paraphrase in terms of language, but I also want to make a point that you can also plagiarize by taking images that are not your own. So make sure that any data that you're representing through a table, a figure, or other is your own creation, and that anything that you're using that comes from another table or another person's figure that's published, that you need to give credit, or if it's just coming from a colleague, right? Give credit where credit is due and acknowledge that. Same thing then with equations, just making sure that you're referencing that it's not your own. Computer science has a kind of a long-standing challenge with this, particularly with coding, where it's so easy, and part of the discipline has been built up by open sharing and sharing of material and code and other things, that it's easy for people to just pull in and forget to give credit where credit is due. And so the field itself is working a lot on ethical use of materials. So let's talk specifically about dishonesty and plagiarism, just so that we can kind of get on the same page. And this does actually talk about computer science as well, but Roberts reviewed incidents of dishonesty at Stanford University over a decade and found that 37% of all incidences were actually attributed to computer science courses, while their students represented less than 7% of the student population at the university. MIT, widely regarded as one of the top computer science schools in the country, made headlines when an introductory computer science course was found to have rampant plagiarism, which resulted in disciplinary action against 73 students. So we know that it's a problem at the student level. As graduate students, and you're working through your courses, we are also held under the same guidelines here at CSU of ethics and integrity as undergraduate students. And so for your courses and for the work that you're doing as a student, that's still covered under student policies. But we also know that then there's field policies, and you can look and see for your field where it is that you might be able to identify some plagiarism lists or other ways that people track in your field specifically. So in computer science, again, I mentioned an effort to reduce accidental plagiarism, where students fail to understand why and they just copy and paste, or where they know how to replicate and use internet sources, but they don't know how to integrate it well. Or they value immediacy over quality and need additional deep skills. And I would say that most of these in this study is specifically talking about undergraduate work, but I think as graduate students, there are elements that transfer over, and in particular, the student value for immediacy over quality, and as well as the students requiring additional deep skills. So I just want to reiterate the earlier point of making sure that you have enough time to process and read through materials and then also digest them and work with them well, because those are the deep skills. That's that deep practice that you will be developing. CSU, again, you can just look up our own student conduct catalog online. And we also have the research, the Office of Research Compliance, and you can take a look through there. And we've had, through the grad professional development series, Kim Cox York come and talk about RCRO a bit and some of the responsible conduct of research topics. But just a reminder that you do have resources here at CSU to think about ethical research, but also then the writing of that research. So we're going to take a look specifically at what it is that the responsible conduct of research department says. And they say, talking about research ethics at CSU, coming from Bernard Rowland he's a university bioethicist, says that any group of persons united in a group for a common purpose, be it in a society or in a university, must operate by a consensus set of rules governing what is seen as right and wrong, good and bad, fair and unfair, just and unjust. Without such rules, one could have not have unified collective entity, and efforts toward achieving a common goal would degenerate into chaos and anarchy, since any human activity faces myriad ethical challenges. Research and scholarly activity conducted at an institution for the accretion of knowledge and the benefit of society falls foursquare under the rubric just described. We at CSU are committed to maximizing the ethical dimensions of what research and scholarship we conduct, as well as the scientific dimensions. Okay, so part of that research and that scholarship and what it is that we conduct, a good portion of that happens through writing, right? And so I just wanted to remind us that here we operate by a consensus set of rules. You can think about, again, common knowledge, that's a rule for your field, but notice how it feels pretty squishy, but there's a consensus at least that you're going to be working within something that is common knowledge within your field, so that you don't have to cite something, and anything that's more specific would have to be cited. Achieving a common goal and kind of creation of new knowledge for sure, and that we at CSU are committed to maximizing those ethical dimensions. That writing is part of that. So types of plagiarism. Let's talk about that specifically. Submitting another person's work as your own, submitting your own work if previously published or submitted to another class is also considered plagiarism. Paying another person to write your paper, patch writing, we talked about that earlier, or copying phrases from various sources and kind of sandwiching them together, not sandwiching, patchworking them together. And then not using quotation marks around quoted material, that words that are other people's, failing to cite your sources, and copying and not crediting figures, tables, images, pictures, or other data and media files. So again, when we're thinking about writing as the project and keeping it pretty broad, which it does include illustrations and figures and tables and other ways that we're working with data. The consequences are pretty great. This fall semester, the book that we're reading for the CSU book club, which you're all more than welcome to join in our last conversation, which is the first Monday in November. And it's on Stuart Ritchie's book on science fictions. And he covers all of this, the fraud and the hype and the irreproducibility and the challenges that we have in scientific fields, most broadly in research professions. But he spends a lot of time talking about your professional reputation is at risk if you plagiarize. Professional skill building, what it is that you know and how it is that you have built your skills in the field is also then at risk, because you're not doing some of the deep work that you need to be doing. You could lose graduate or professional position and or funding. Research misconduct is expensive for the field. Retracted papers are costly. And then additional research on that takes place or builds off of papers that have been retracted, but people have not yet noticed or done their due diligence, expensive. Research misconduct can affect research quality of an entire specialization. So this is in that Miguel piece that I recommend that you go and also when I send out an email, by the way, I'll send out the they say, I say, but also then I'll send out a link and you can access the document. But it gives an example from entomology, ecology, looking at bees, and it gives various versions of how you can see the original version being reworked, either paraphrased or summarized. And I'd like us to take a look at the example that he gives. And if you go and collect the document, you'll see that there's multiple versions of this that you can see. But the original version in the blue, and on the left corner, the left side, is this study examines whether workers of S. invicta are able to assist their mothers in colony usurpations. First, we tested whether queens of S. invicta are better able to usurp colonies to which their daughters have moved. Second, we tested whether the effects of the daughters on usurpation success is due to familiarity with the queen or to genetic relatedness. And aggressive behavior during these usurpation attempts was observed to determine if the presence of familiar or related workers influenced the aggressive response toward either the resident queen or the queen attempting usurpation. Okay, so we're talking about bees, and this is a methods portion, right? First, second, last. And methods are tricky, right? This is somebody describing what it is that they did. So if we're going to paraphrase that, how can we make sure that we're doing it well, that we've digested it well enough so that we know how it is that it's going to contribute to our own story that we're telling about our own research and not plagiarize. And what we have in the yellow on the right-hand column is a plagiarized version. And you can see through all of the red underlined portions that these are direct rephrasing, right, or direct words pulled rather than being rephrased, so that this is just, it's plagiarized. It's also plagiarized because there's no credit given. There's no quotation marks. There are certain things that are changed and that could suggest that you've moved things around, but even then it's or changed the language, but even then it's still pretty close. So here's the explanation of that. The first two paraphrase sentences appear to have undergone moderate modifications. However, the second two sentences have not been adequately paraphrased. The third sentence was changed by just a mere substitution of the first two or three words. And the first two sentences were not sufficiently modified because that last two sentences contained only minimal changes. This rewritten version still is considered plagiarism. Here you have a proper paraphrase. It's the same passage, by the way, but here you can see that we know who is doing what right from the very beginning. It's Ballas and Adams carried out an investigation to determine whether S. invicta mothers are helped by their worker offspring during colony takeovers. These authors asked whether the colony takeover by S. invicta queens is more effective when their daughters first invade the colonies. The second hypothesis concerned the extent to which daughters' familiarity with the queen or their genetic similarity to her affects successful colony takeover. During these occupation attempts, aggressive behavior of usurping workers that were either familiar or genetically related was observed to see if these variable mediated aggressive behavior toward the invading or the resident queen. So notice, this is a passage that has been digested. Someone is explaining what the others have done, right? What Ballas and Adams did with their study and their methodology. And that the words themselves, there are enough there that match up, of course, because we need to have a clear description, and yet they're all reshaped through the sentence structure, new syntax, and arrangement of the ideas so that we get the sense, and I keep using the term digested, but I really do think it's one of the great ways that we can think about how it is that we process the material and then explain it in our own words to someone else. So how do you do that? I'm going to recommend 6 Ds and 1 C, and that's designate, digest, distinguish, distance, decide, describe, and credit. We're going to move through these pretty quickly. So designate, we've already talked about it, but make sure that you have set aside enough time for your reading and your writing. I would recommend a minimum of 30 minutes a day. Regular habit formation is really helpful. It doesn't have to be at the same time, by the way. Studies on habit suggest that you just have to be aware that you need to be doing this work every day at a time that works for you during that day. And it's really helpful if you separate out your reading and drafting from your editing sessions. Digest, highly recommend read slowly and process clearly. For those of you who attended the reverse outlining workshop, that's part of that, slowing things down. And if you reverse outline a document, you'll understand so much better. We had a conversation about that, right? And then I would recommend a 3-step reading method if you're using foundational sources and things that you have to write about clearly and well. That's where you skim through it and you just kind of get a sense of what's there. You read through it with care, and then you go back and you take notes and pull what it is that you need to understand. And by doing that, by slowing down that reading process just enough, only with those foundational texts, right, the ones that you have to write about well, it allows for you to process them and digest them enough so that you can then think about how they relate to your own work and write about them in your own words. So that 3-step method: pre-read, read, and then take notes. If you can separate out the taking notes from the reading portion, which is oftentimes what we push together, it's really helpful, as again, for kind of separating out a little bit of that process so that you can just consume and kind of understand and then go back. And part of that processing is identifying what's important and then why it's important and how it's related to the work that you're doing. Distinguishing between what they say and what you say. I also think it's really helpful if you do a double entry note-taking system. We talk about this in the literature review workshop, but keeping content on one side of a page that's from the text itself and then your response. It's really nice to just have something that separates out your response to what it is that you're reading. If all you have are notes on the page, it's really easy to go back and just assume that the material's there and to pull from that and to not have digested it fully. So I highly recommend just slowing things down a little bit. And you can, I think handwriting, the data's in on the difference between copying, pasting, and typing up, and that handwriting generally works better for most people in being able to digest information. But you can take notes however it is that you want, just as long as you know the difference between what it is that they say and what it is that you say in response, so that you can understand those distinctions. That distance, temporal and conceptual, meaning that you have time to digest, right? We just talked about that, but also enough for you to think about how it is that your work is in conversation with other people's, which means that you have your own description of how it is that their work is related or not. You get to decide, making sure that you have enough time also to just make some decisions about what's useful in a text. And sometimes when we're new to a field, it seems like everything is useful in a text, and it's really helpful to then read through a few more documents, pull some information and key ideas, and then see how they're related, and that you get to make then some decisions on what data, analysis, figures, references you'll be using. If you can decide that before your writing session, that's part of your preparation. Super helpful for you being able to continue to digest and then think about how you're going to be writing about things later on. And I would schedule, if you can, separate sessions for reading, analyzing, illustrating, drafting, revising, proofreading. This is the kind of the length of the time that it takes to do academic writing, that some of us are a little bit disappointed that it's not just sitting down and just cranking it out, because we're brilliant, of course, but we want, just to have it written from beginning, middle, and end and have a document be done. It's an iterative process in which we are reading and then writing a little bit and then generating some data and analyzing some data. And so there's this kind of iterative back and forth and moving through to be able to build out a document. And then consider this last one, the C. Consider, in what ways does the source influence your own work? What do your readers need to know from the source in relation to your own research and argument? Should you paraphrase, summarize, or use a combination? So you get to decide which is the best way to give some attention in your own work to work that's been done before. What will work best for your purposes? Do you need to summarize a big text or portion of it in a couple sentences, or do you need to paraphrase very specific portions and ideas from theirs? What signal phrases can you use to help introduce source material? So if you think about templates for they say, how can I introduce what it is that they're saying? So according to, or listening their names, right? At the very beginning. So there are ways that you can signal readers to let them know that they're going to be reading someone else's words, quotation marks, right? And separating your words from theirs. Have I relied too much on sources? Those are great questions. Patch writing, for those of you who are finding yourself patch writing, one of the ways, start looking and seeing what pulls them apart just a little bit. How is it that you're understanding the connections between those ideas from others, and see if you can include some of that. And where should you build stronger quote sandwiches? I think quote sandwiches are a great way for you to consider not just quotations, but also then paraphrasing. Introduce what somebody else said, what is it that they said, and then how is it that it's relevant, and how can it move your argument or ideas further. In describing, how does that work relate to your own and your own research interests and findings? Use that quote sandwich. Again, it helps you maintain control. It's a really helpful technique. And giving credit, follow that community guide. Take a look and see what we have here on campus through CSU RICRO. You can see your journals, whatever your journals are in your field, how it is that they give credit. When you're in doubt, just remember cite and take time with those final reads of manuscripts to confirm your citations, and making sure that you have time to do that. And I know that by the end, usually we're kind of wiped out, but if you could build in perhaps time to take a look at bibliographies at the end of a writing session where you wanted to be working for about an hour and a half, but by an hour and 10, 15 minutes, you're kind of wiped out. You can spend the last 10, 15 minutes working through your bibliography, making sure, just checking citations and doing it gradually over time rather than all at the last minute, which is oftentimes what happens. All right, so speaking about the last minute, I think we're here getting close to our Q&A time. We have about 3 minutes left in this session, but I can also stay until 1 o'clock so we can have a little bit more time for conversation. But until we meet again, may your writing be brief, frequent, low stress, and highly rewarding and ethical. Right? Your voice matters. I really appreciate you giving some feedback on this workshop. If you need to reach out, please do that. If you'd like to, just take a picture of the QR code and I can pop the URL in the chat for a moment. But let's just open it up for some Q&A. And I'm going to stop recording so that we can have that